The secret economic engine that powers NATO was never just about weapons. It was about risk, whether investors would put money into rebuilding factories in cities that had been destroyed, whether currencies would stabilize or spiral out of control again, and whether Western Europe would become more politically extreme because of the terrible conditions of hunger, unemployment, and fear. This is the part that most people completely miss. Before NATO was a military alliance, it was a way to protect the economy. This is where money, power, and the past all come together. And things are never as easy as they seem. Article 5, which says that all NATO members will defend each other, troops stationed along borders, and the Cold War standoff between East and West are what most people think of when they hear the word NATO. They think of nuclear weapons, strategy rooms with battle maps on the walls, and deterrence. But by the time NATO was officially formed in April 1949, the biggest threat to Europe wasn't a Soviet tank battalion crossing the Rhine. It was the end of the economy. The Second World War had left Western Europe in ruins and in debt. Cities were turned into ruins. The amount of goods produced in countries like France and Italy had dropped. Germany's economy had been destroyed. The systems for getting around were broken. There was a lot of food scarcity. The value of currencies changed a lot. Political movements were becoming more extreme. The Great Depression wasn't just a lesson in history. It was a recent trauma. In the 1930s, the economy fell apart, which led to extremism. A lot of people were angry because they were out of work. Trade was ruined by protectionism. And that economic collapse had led to a world war. People in Washington, London, and Paris who made decisions weren't guessing what instability looked like. They had just lived through it. In 1947, the United States had a hard choice to make. Western Europe was too weak to recover on its own, but it was also too important to leave. In France and Italy, communist parties were gaining ground. The Soviet Union was gaining power in all of Eastern Europe. And without stabilizing the economy, it was hard to say how politics would line up. In June 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall announced the Marshall Plan, a huge program of economic aid meant to help rebuild Western Europe. The U.S. gave about $13 billion in grants, loans, food, fuel, and industrial equipment between 1948 and 1952. That's more than $150 billion in today's money. The Marshall Plan wasn't a gift, though. It was a calculation. A strong economy would stop people from becoming politically radical. If politics were stable, the Soviet Union would stop growing. And a stable Western Europe would become a reliable trading partner and ally in a global financial system that is based on the dollar. Money and power were moving in the same direction. But there was a problem that no amount of steel or grain could fix. Investors do and build factories in places they think might be invaded next year. Capital wants things to be predictable. It wants to know that borders will stay in place and governments will stay in power. Rebuilding without safety is like playing with fire. And in 1948, it still looked like a huge risk to go to Western Europe. That year's Berlin blockade made the stakes very clear. When the Soviet Union cut off land access to West Berlin, it wasn't just a political move. It was a sign that Europe's future was still up for grabs. The U.S. sent planes to Berlin for almost a year to help the city. It was a work of art in terms of logistics. But airlifts aren't a good long-term economic policy. It showed that strategic uncertainty could destroy an economic recovery in a single night. This is the background in which NATO was formed. 12 countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty on April 4, 1949. Article 5 said that if one member was attacked, it would be seen as an attack on all. It was framed as a military obligation. But it did something very important for the economy. It made it less likely that there would be a major disruption. That lowering of perceived risk was more important than any shipment of steel. Security made things less uncertain. Less uncertainty brought in money. Capital rebuilt the economy. Industry helped keep politics stable. NATO didn't directly rebuild Europe. It made it possible for people to invest in rebuilding. Western Europe grew very quickly in the early 1950s. The production of goods in factories went up again. There was more trade. The quality of life started to rise. People in West Germany and other places called this time the economic miracle, but it didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a situation where military security and economic integration helped each other. The Marshall Plan gave the U.S. money, and NATO gave the U.S. a way to protect itself. That shield let European governments put rebuilding ahead of spending on defense. Instead of building huge standing armies, they fixed up industries, infrastructure, and social safety nets. But this wasn't a deal that only one side got. The U.S. didn't give Europe money out of kindness. The alliance gave Washington strategic, financial, and long-lasting structural returns. The United States put the dollar at the center of world trade by linking Western Europe's security to American power. The Bretton Woods system tied currencies to the dollar, and the dollar could be turned into gold. But that monetary system relied on trust that the Western Bloc would stay together and stable. NATO made that trust stronger. A safe Europe was more likely to use dollars for trade, to become more economically integrated under U.S. influence, and to recycle capital through U.S. financial markets. Stability in other countries helped the dollar stay strong at home. At the same time, NATO let the U.S. move its troops forward across the Atlantic. American strategic reach was expanded by bases in Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, and other places. It's cheaper and more effective to defend Europe from within Europe than to project power from thousands of miles away. The alliance turned the U.S. military's strength into political and economic power. A global security presence is one of the best things for a currency's stability. As Western Europe rebuilt, it became not only a political ally but also a huge market for exports. American goods, machines, and money went out. The growth of Europe made people who could pay for things. The Marshall Plan didn't just move money around. It made people into customers. Rich allies buy more than poor ones. This is where the story gets more complicated than the usual Cold War story. It wasn't just about stopping Soviet tanks for NATO. It was about stopping political opportunities from coming up because of economic instability. It was about lowering the risk premium on democracy in Western Europe and putting the U.S. in the middle. And that difference is important. This is because alliances that are made to stabilize the economy act differently than alliances that are made just for war. They change the flow of trade. They have an effect on financial decisions. They change how people invest. They decide who is safe enough to take risks and who isn't. Policymakers knew that markets and military commitments were linked, even when no one was watching. A guarantee of defense calmed the bond markets. A stable currency made it easier for people to trade across borders. A stable geopolitical situation made it less likely for people to take their money out of the country. Safety turned into a financial asset. By the middle of the 1950s, the Western Bloc had not only become stable, which was the first step toward the European Union, working together on economic issues NATO made it less likely that other countries would attack. However, loops make things dependent on each other. As money moved around in a safe area, economic growth became linked to political alignment. And as the Cold War got worse, NATO's military side grew, but its economic side was still very important. The alliance changed over time because it had both military and economic goals. If you only think of NATO as a defense pact, you're missing half of what it is. It was a system that was meant to keep things stable, make sure that people had the right incentives, and protect a certain way of doing business. It calmed the markets by saying that geopolitical fragmentation would not happen again like it did in the 1930s. But systems that are made to be stable do more than just keep enemies away. They change how people act. And once military commitments and economic confidence are linked, it becomes hard to separate them. At that point, NATO isn't just about defense. It's also about the trustworthiness of the whole Western financial system. And that's where the deeper story starts, the realization that military alliances can also be used to build economies. After NATO was formed, the Western Alliance did more than just organize troop movements. It set up expectations. And expectations are what drives markets without being seen. Industrial output in the 1950s and 1960s. The Bretton Woods system used gold to back the dollar, which served as the base for international trade. NATO protected Western Europe while it quickly rebuilt and became economically integrated. The pieces fit together. The outcome was a safe economic zone where trade grew, investment across borders grew, and supply chains got stronger. Western Europe became not only a military ally but also an economic partner in a EU-centered financial system. It wasn't just force that kept the dollar on top. It was also trust in a system that seemed strong and stable. But there are costs to being cohesive. By the end of the 1960s, the cost of keeping global security commitments was starting to hurt the American economy. The Vietnam War, along with high domestic spending and rising international dollar debts, put a lot of stress on U.S. gold reserves. President Richard Nixon stopped people from being able to change dollars into gold in 1971. This effectively ended the Bretton Woods system. The gold window was shut. The dollar was free to move. The world changed. But NATO didn't fall apart. The security framework stayed the same, and that was important. Even though currencies floated and financial markets became more flexible, the transatlantic security commitment gave people a sense of stability. The alliance kept saying that the Western Bloc would stay together. That signal supported further integration, both militarily and economically. In finance, perception is very important, and it's hard to say too much about it. A bond market reacts not only to how much debt there is, but also to how stable the government is. By showing that NATO was united, it strengthened the idea that the Western system was strong, even when its money changed. At the same time, the process of integrating Europe sped up. The European economic community grew. Barriers to trade went down. The euro came after the European Union. All of this happened at the same time. It was easier to work toward economic integration when everyone was protected by the same security umbrella. Member states could concentrate on markets instead of reciprocal distrust. Security lessened internal conflict, which in turn lowered transaction costs both politically and economically. That's how NATO's economy works. This arrangement seemed obvious during the Cold War. The Soviet Union was a clear threat from the outside. The Western Bloc fell into line. But when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, many people thought NATO would no longer be important. What was the point of the alliance if the enemy was gone? NATO, on the other hand, grew. Countries that used to be in the Warsaw Pact joined. The alliance went to the east. That was when NATO was no longer just a response to a specific threat. It was built into the way the West's political and economic systems worked. Membership meant that the government was stable, the rules were clear, and the risk of war was lower. That was already factored in by investors. Countries in the alliance had to pay lower risk premiums. Not only financial metrics, but also strategic positioning were taken into account when setting borrowing costs. The market saw NATO membership as a sign of strength. Security became a sign of economic strength. This doesn't mean that NATO had direct control over markets. It means that markets took into account NATO membership when figuring out how risky something was. People thought that countries in the alliance were more stable than those that weren't. Lower perceived risk meant lower borrowing costs, more investment, and more integration. Being seen as part of a powerful group is the best way to lower a country's risk premium. This setup also made things uneven at the same time. The United States still paid too much for defense, which was a cost of keeping an entire economic bloc in line with its own financial system. European countries, which were protected by the security umbrella, put more money into their own welfare and economic growth. That imbalance sometimes led to political problems. However, friction within a stable framework differs from fragmentation. The bigger problem, especially in the 21st century, is that it's getting harder to separate NATO's economic side from global politics. They are also economic arteries. When things get tense on NATO's eastern side, the markets react. Prices of energy go up and down. Stocks in defense companies go up. Changes are made to government budgets. Inflationary pressures spread out. The line between military alliances and economic structures is getting less clear. This connection is impossible to miss in 2026. Discussions about defense spending aren't just about tanks and planes. They're also about how to spend money wisely when debt is high and inflation is always there. Not only are questions about burden sharing strategic, they are also financial. A government that spends more on the military has to either raise taxes, cut programs, or borrow more money. Every choice has an impact on the economy. At the same time, geopolitical risk has a direct effect on markets. Commodity prices and investor sentiment are affected by problems in the supply chain, sanctions, and conflicts in the region. When NATO countries work together to impose sanctions or respond to security threats, they are changing trade flows around the world as well as military positions. This is why it's not enough to only look at NATO from a military point of view. If security lowers uncertainty and uncertainty affects capital, then NATO's health has an effect on markets. Risk premiums change when the alliance's unity wavers. When commitments are called into question, currencies and bond yields change. The economic part isn't a side effect. It's built in. Think about energy. Western Europe depended on Russian natural gas for a long time. When that dependence met geopolitical tensions, energy prices shot up. Governments rushed to make sure they had a variety of supplies. The policies for defense and energy became linked. Then came inflation. Households felt the effects not through troop movements but through their utility bills. There are subtle ways in which money and power meet. A partnership that keeps borders stable also keeps trade stable. An alliance that stops aggression also affects energy corridors and investments in infrastructure. NATO's expansion to the east did more than just move a line of defense. It also changed the way people thought about the economy in whole regions. This doesn't mean that NATO is good or bad, it makes it structural, and structures last. The main point here is not that NATO secretly runs the world's economy. It's that stable security frameworks are needed for economic systems to work. The Western financial system has been based on the idea that the Atlantic will stay stable since Bretton Woods. If you take that assumption away, markets would have to change the price of risk. There wouldn't be any speeches that would change the price. It would show up in bond yields, exchange rates, and choices about where to invest. It would show up as higher borrowing costs, lower growth expectations, and more volatility. Security commitments have an effect on spreadsheets. This is where the present comes into play. In a time of rising debt, demographic pressure, and geopolitical competition, alliances are under more stress. Budgets for defense go up, the government's money gets tighter. The markets are paying close attention. It's easy to think of these debates in terms of ideas, but the economic layer is deeper. Alliances like NATO affect the way money moves around the world. They affect how investors see a region as either unified or broken up. History shows us that political instability often follows economic instability. After the First World War, Europe fell apart because of financial problems and protectionism. After World War II, coordinated security and rebuilding of the economy led to stability. That lesson led to the creation of NATO. It was built on the idea that security isn't just about the military, it's also about the economy. And that leads us to the last thought. Alliances aren't just about who you protect. They have to do with the kind of economic system you keep going. NATO was formed because people were afraid of both an invasion and an economic collapse. It brought together armies and markets, money and promises to protect. It made things less uncertain long enough for a new economic system to grow. Knowing something doesn't mean you know what side to take in today's arguments. It tells you what's at stake under them. People will fight over NATO in 2026 over budgets, borders, and strategy. But they're also arguing about the architecture that supports transatlantic markets and keeps the economy stable, whether they know it or not. Incentives stay the same, but history doesn't. Security reduces risk. Less risk draws in money. Capital makes systems. Systems make things dependent on each other. When money and power get mixed up, it's not easy to separate them. If this changed the way you think, hit subscribe. I'll show you where to look for the answers in history.